From widespread destruction to one of the largest refugee crises in the world, consequences of the war in Ukraine have reverberated globally. Today, we're going to delve into the 2022 events from the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian, and this is the War in Ukraine 2022. Our historical strategy game, Fire and Maneuver, has left early access and is available now. Check it out with the link below. In order to understand the origins of the war, it is crucial to examine the events that triggered the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, starting with the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of hostilities in Donbass. In early 2014, the Euromaidan protests led to the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Soon after, Yanukovych fled to Russia. A wave of pro-Russian unrest erupted in eastern and southern Ukraine. Simultaneously, unmarked Russian troops, which had already been stationed in military bases within Crimea, took control of government buildings, strategic sites, and infrastructure. In March, Moscow would hold a highly contentious referendum which led to Crimea being annexed by Russia. The results of this referendum were not recognized by the international community. Soon after, armed pro-Russian separatists seized government buildings in Donbass and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The separatists received considerable covert support from Russia, and Ukrainian attempts to fully retake the separatist-held areas were unsuccessful. The fighting would continue in 2015, especially around Donetsk, Luhansk, and Mariupol, with the separatists intent on gaining control of the oblasts. Still, the front lines would soon become largely static. As a result, in February 2015, Russia and Ukraine signed the Minsk II agreements in a bid to end the conflict, although the agreements were never fully implemented. The Donbass War settled into a violent but effectively frozen conflict, with many brief ceasefires, no lasting peace, and few changes in territorial control. A major escalation would happen 3 years later, as the Russian Coast Guard fired upon and captured 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels after they attempted to transit from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov. The Kerch Strait incident flared up tensions, and martial law was briefly declared by Ukraine in fears that a full-scale war would soon break out between the two countries, but new conflict did not come. Nevertheless, as soon as Crimea was annexed, Moscow had begun to integrate the regions under their control, issuing hundreds of thousands of Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. This violent status quo continued for years until the beginning of 2021, when Russia built up a large military presence near its border with Ukraine, including from neighboring Belarus. The Kremlin denied any ill will regarding these troop concentrations, stating that they were in the area to perform military exercises. Nonetheless, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of infringing on the rights of Russian speakers and used Ukrainian collaboration with the Germans in the Second World War to accuse some in the Kyiv government of supporting neo-Nazis. Putin argued that Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, rather that Lenin had created it by carving a Soviet republic out of Russian imperial land, and that Stalin and Khrushchev expanded Ukraine after the Second World War. Putin continued to criticize the enlargement of NATO publicly and demanded that Ukraine be barred from ever joining. Alongside this, he also demanded the removal of multinational forces stationed in NATO's Eastern European member states. These demands were rejected by NATO, and Ukraine, under US influence, continues to seek more integration with the West. On February 21st, Putin announced that the Russian government would diplomatically recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The same evening, Putin directed that Russian troops deploy into Donbass, in what Russia referred to as a peacekeeping mission, In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ordered a 30-day nationwide state of emergency and the mobilization of all reservists. On the morning of February 24th, Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, air and missile strikes were conducted across the country. This was followed shortly thereafter by a large ground invasion along multiple fronts. Zelensky declared martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 and 60 who were banned from leaving the country. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus toward Kyiv, a northeastern front toward Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Donbass. Many expected the invasion to be a short affair that would go in Russia's favor, with even the Americans offering Zelensky evacuation, but the Ukrainians resisted. The Northern Front, which was supposed to be a dash to Kyiv to topple the government, a daring airborne assault to capture the Antonov airport also failed after the damaging of the ensuing battle, which the Russians won, rendered the airport inoperable. The Russians would be halted at the suburbs of Kyiv during the month-long battles of Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha. Russian logistical issues were evidently seen, as their columns stretched for kilometers in a traffic jam. The Ukrainian military quickly took advantage of this vulnerability, ambushing Russian vehicles and further worsening their supply situation. By April, Russian command had realized that their offensive had run out of steam and decided to withdraw from the Kyiv front to redeploy elsewhere. Ukrainians later discovered that a number of civilians were executed in Bucha when Russian forces left the area. Russian fortunes were different in the south, with the recapture of the North Crimean Canal on the day the invasion started. The canal, which had previously supplied 85% of Crimea's drinking and irrigation water, was blocked by Ukraine after its Russian annexation. As such, its capture represented an important objective for Moscow. 2 days later, the siege of Mariupol began as the Russian army linked east with the separatist-held Donbass. Russian forces would also alarm the international community by attacking the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, stoking fears of a potential nuclear catastrophe. At the time of making this video, the power plant remains under Russian control. Russian troops would also attack from Crimea toward the west, with many theorizing that Russia wanted to push to Odessa and link up with the pro-Russian separatist region of Transnistria in Moldova. It was on this front that the first major Ukrainian city, Kherson, fell to the Russian army. The fall of Kherson was accompanied by the capture of Antonovsky Bridge. Holding this strategic crossing over the Dnieper River would allow Russian forces to attack the important junction city of Mykolaiv. The Russians attempted to take the city but were repelled, stopping their advance toward Odessa. In the east, the Russian army attempted to capture Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. While Kharkiv is less than 35 kilometers from the Russian border, the Ukrainians put up strong resistance. Subsequently, the city was continuously bombarded and shelled as Russian forces tried to surround the city. Although they had some success, especially toward the southeast with the taking of Izium, the Russian push toward Kharkiv ultimately petered out. Amid the heightened shelling of Kharkiv, on March 31st, a helicopter strike took place against an oil supply depot inside Russia in the city of Belgorod, noteworthy as it happened on the other side of the border. The Kremlin was quick to blame Kyiv, while Ukraine denied responsibility. Advance from the Donbass was slower in comparison to the other fronts, as the region had already been the setting of battles since 2014. As a result, Ukrainian troops there were already well entrenched. Meanwhile, the siege of Mariupol was underway. The battle included troops from the regular Russian army, as well as the Donetsk People's Republic militia. The urban warfare for control of the city was slow and bloody. In an official statement, the United Nations confirmed the deaths of 1,348 civilians in Mariupol, but warned that the true death toll was likely higher. The UN also reported that 90% of the city's residential buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The city's defenders were eventually cornered into the Azovstal steelworks, a maze of a metallurgical facility that served as a well-defensible position. As a result, on April 21st, Putin ordered Russian troops not to storm it, opting to blockade it instead. The Russians did continue to shell the steelworks, with heavy airstrikes on the 27th and 28th of April. The humanitarian crisis in the city was becoming increasingly dire, and after a visit by the UN Security General to Moscow, the United Nations and the Red Cross started to run evacuations throughout a humanitarian corridor. Many civilians were still trapped in the steelworks, although they would continue to be pulled out during the following days. By May 7th, the Ukrainian government reported that all of the civilians in the steel plant had been evacuated. With many heavily injured and low on ammunition, food, and supplies, the remaining defenders surrendered by the 20th. 6 days later, Russia reopened the port of Mariupol to commercial vessels following mine removal. With Ukraine being a major producer of wheat, the taking, blockading, and mining of its Black Sea ports had serious global repercussions, with increased wheat prices and the threat of famine, especially in the Middle East. As a result, the Black Sea theater has also been significant. The Russian Navy drew first blood, taking control of Snake Island after their cruiser, Moskva, bombarded it. Russia has an overwhelming advantage at sea, which became even more pronounced once the Ukrainian Navy scuttled its flagship, the frigate Hetman Sahayadechny. Despite this, Ukraine managed to somewhat even the odds by sinking the Moskva with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. However, the Kremlin denies this, claiming that it was a munition explosion caused by a fire. Eventually, Moscow and Kyiv would reach an agreement brokered by the UN and Turkey, aiming to resume grain exports. After the retreat from Kyiv, the Russian military concentrated their efforts on the south and the east. Although they managed some advances, the Ukrainian military managed to hold the line for the most part. On the 6th of September, prompted by the wave of military aid from the west, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in Kharkiv, which successfully cleared the surrounding areas and eliminated any risk of losing the city. 15 days later, Putin announced partial mobilization, which was followed by an exodus of young Russian men from the country. In late September, Moscow would organize referendums in the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts, and hurriedly proclaimed their annexations to the Russian Federation. These oblasts were not completely occupied by Russian forces, and the majority of the international community do not recognize the claims of the annexation. At the same time, the Ukrainian military was conducting an offensive in the south. Although it would take them months, the Ukrainians managed to disrupt Russian supply lines to the point that it made their positions on the western bank of the Dnieper untenable. This was worsened by an attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was a crucial supply line. After repeated attacks and being forced back, the Russian military decided to retreat from the provincial capital back to the eastern bank, successfully completing an orderly withdrawal. In the wake of the success of the Kherson offensive, the war had shifted back to the Donbass, where Wagner Group mercenaries have been involved in intense fighting to capture Bakhmut. This stage of the war has been characterized by brutal fighting with little forward movement for either side. With sites of trenches and a pronounced no man's land, some have called this phase reminiscent of the First World War. A first among our videos, the conflict in Ukraine remains ongoing at the time of release. While today the front lines have become much more static than last year, now that the snow has thawed, new offensives have introduced some semblance of movement to the front once more, as Ukraine receives an increasing amount of military aid from the West. Join us next year for the